We're going to be preaching something just a little bit different here this morning. I had a sermon that I was going to preach. You can see that in your bulletin. After the bulletin was printed, I decided, based on yesterday's events, that this would be a good time to preach a different kind of a sermon here this morning. My central idea, and we'll be spending an awful lot of time in 1 Samuel this morning. As I've often mentioned before, the Bible has plenty to say to the political sphere. Plenty to say. Especially, how can you deny it, especially when you have entire books named after people like Kings and Chronicles of the Kings and Judges? How can you possibly say that we're not going to talk about what the Bible has to say to the political sphere, to the polis, which is another word for city, an important word in the English language, of course. We get the word police and polite from that word, the polis, the political sphere. So this morning we're going to address some of these things. Again, in somewhat in light of what occurred yesterday, we're going to address that as well. But we're going to spend an awful lot of time in 1 Samuel. Some of you folks that have been with the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society for a long time have heard some of this before. We'll try to make this fresh. But my purpose this morning is to be able to talk to you and let you know that we do not have to address society and the state in general terms all the time. Kind of like be kind to each other and obey the government, these kinds of general things that people will say. No, the Bible has specific things to say about the limits of governmental authority. If you don't know what the Bible has to say about the legitimate limits of governmental authority, you will never be able to recognize tyranny. Do you understand that? I hope you do. If you don't get the limits, then the government will never be overextending their limits because you don't know what they are. Imagine a baseball game where there's no foul ball. It's just wherever you get hit. Or a football game where everything's in bounds. No, you have to know where the limits are in order to know what's going on, what's happening. John just read there from Exodus chapter 30 and Deuteronomy chapter 17. In Exodus 30, I'm going to just address this very, very quickly here. We have an example here of what I believe looks like the limits of the governmental authority to tax people. Here in Exodus 30, verse 11, the Lord speaking to Moses, when you take the census of the children of Israel for their number, every man shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, that there may be no plague among them when you number them. There's a lot more we could say about this passage. But what we do see here, and I believe this is a one-time census here, because later on they were told not to number the people. This looks like a one-time census to raise money for the tabernacle, if you will, because the tabernacle here is in this context. But what we don't see here is any kind of penalty on the children of Israel directly by the state on the people if they don't give. Understand that. There's no penalty, there's no jail time, there's no 50 lashes or anything like that. It says that there'd be no plague among them. So what's happening is God is reserving to himself the ability to punish the people, and he's not giving it to the state or to anyone else. You see, we don't believe things like this today because all we see is the state. We don't believe in a God. Our cosmology does not allow for a God who actually punishes nations. It's all just a crapshoot as far as we're concerned. But here God says, no, if these people don't give, essentially what he's saying is, it might be a plague among them, that there'll be no plague, and I'm in charge of plagues around here. A lot more we could say about that from Exodus. But going over to Deuteronomy chapter 17, where we just were, we saw that the king, when a king comes on the scene, his job is to write out the law of God. Now, why would he have to do that? Well, he would have to do that in order to know what his limits are and what his responsibilities are. You see, what we see happening all the time we see this. We see the state exceeding its authority. And then when the state exceeds its authority in one area, we see it neglecting its responsibility in another. And we see this constantly all the time. The state involved, for example, in transfer welfare payments, for example. At the same time then, giving up on its responsibility to punish the wicked with the sword and praising the good, as we see in Romans 13. Interestingly enough, we have a great example here in Deuteronomy chapter 17. This is a terrific example. Starting here in verse 14, when you come into the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess, and say, I will set a king over me, and we'll look at that in just a few minutes, like all the nations that are around me. Now, what we see happening here is God looking ahead to see what they're going to do, and that's exactly what they said later on, as we will see in 1 Samuel. Give us a king like all the other nations. Here's a valuable insight, I trust. The children of Israel were never supposed to be like all the other nations around them. All the other nations around them were to be like them. That's still true today, by the way. Well, let's go on. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. He shall not multiply horses for himself, verse 16, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. And I'm not so sure he's really talking about literally going back to Egypt here. What he's talking about, I believe, is power politics. Power from the top. And that's what Egypt was all about. You know, when you can make a statement as a pharaoh, and you can say, hey, you know what, these people over here, let's kill all their boy babies. And everybody does it. That's power, bro. And God's saying, we don't want this king to have that kind of power at all. Multiplying horses. Multiplying horses was always a symbol of power in this context. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself. When he sits on the throne, verse 18, of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of the law in his book from the one before the priests and the Levites. So, it appears as if the priests and the Levites are going to be present while the king is writing this out. Here is a beautiful picture of the responsibility of the ecclesiastical authorities, the church authorities, if you will, the authority that they have with the civil authorities. It's a beautiful picture. Again, the ecclesiastical authorities have the power of the word. The civil authorities have the power of the sword. But who informs the civil authorities? It's the ecclesiastical authorities. It's the church people. And now we have today the church people saying, that's the last thing we're going to do. Well, no wonder we have such problems. This is not difficult. You don't have to like search under rocks to try to figure it out. Why are they doing such awful things? Because the church isn't telling them what they can and can't do. And right here from the very beginning, we see that it's the job of the ecclesiastical authorities, the church authorities, to inform the civil authorities. This is not difficult, my friends. It's maddening that we have the people that supposedly believe the Bible, supposedly preach the Bible. They have the one area that they won't preach. You ever notice? One area where it's needed the most is the one where we want to preach the least. What an absolute mess. Well, I decided to change the sermon this morning. I want to share some personal things that I can attest to myself that have to do with corruption again. Who knows what corruption is? if you don't know the limits of the civil authority as prescribed by the scriptures. Other than that, it's just a crapshoot. So, just some personal things here. Just some personal things. This thing that happened yesterday that appears to have been an assassination attempt. It sure looks that way. I went to college inside the Beltway, in the D.C. Beltway. It was in Maryland. It was Atlanta, Maryland. But I got to D.C. from time to time. I was at Jimmy Carter's inauguration. Can you imagine that? I was there. 1977. I got to see the Secret Service and the police in action. Everywhere you looked, there was somebody with a rifle, some kind of official on the roof. I still remember when they were, before the limousine went through with the new President Carter, I still remember cops looking up at a building. Of course, now we're talking about Washington, D.C., so you have all kinds of skyscraper buildings all over the place. And there was a window open, and they noticed this, and they made the people at the window, there were people looking out, said, you got to close that window. And they stood there until that window got closed. I was at the National Religious Broadcasters meeting when George Bush came there, and there was all manner of security going on. There is no possible way you can tell me that there isn't something really, really funny going on with yesterday's events. I don't know what. The corruption is just so deep, who even knows? I have no idea, but I do know this. You don't have an empty rooftop the way it worked at one time, anyway. You don't have an empty rooftop and the Secret Service and the police are like, duh. It doesn't happen. Did happen yesterday, though. But our problem is now, we've been lied to so often that language, don't believe anything you hear and only half of what you see, that's kind of like crept into us, isn't it? Like what's really going on? Who knows? Who can tell? Well, let me go on a little bit further here. I just want to say personally, I saw security myself at some of these events, and they were not leaving rooftops unattended. They were on it. Yesterday, apparently, a guy drags a rifle up to a rooftop, lays down, aims, and duh. Wonder what he's doing. Something way wrong is going on. Other personal things. So we had Reagan in 1980 to 88. We had George Bush in 88 through 92. Clinton after that. So in 93, I was on my way to work. And a broadcast came over the radio that I want to tell you that, most of you can't remember this, but I didn't really care that much for George Bush. And when Clinton was running against Bush in 92 and inaugurated 93, Clinton wins. I honestly didn't care that much. I didn't know how bad Clinton was, but I was about to find out. You might recall, those of you that lived through that, you might recall that what happened was Bush was being presented as a liberal Republican, and Clinton was being presented as a conservative Democrat. That's what was going on. They could do that back then. So I'm driving to work, and I hear on the radio that an important official in the Clinton administration was found dead in one of the local parks. I believe it was Greenbelt Park. Okay, that was weird enough. But then I heard this. And again, at this point, I don't suspect Clinton at all. I mean, who knows? But then I hear this, that the park police are going to conduct the murder investigation. Well, I was from the Washington, D.C. area, and I knew the job of the park police at the time. They didn't do murder investigations. We used to go to Greenbelt Park. We used to travel around Greenbelt Lake. Remember that, Sweets? Kids were little. We'd push the baby cart around, whatever baby stroller thing around. And it was the park police that had to tell you that we close at sundown and please put your fire out. And on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, there's a roadkill, and guess whose responsibility that was? That would be the park police. And when I heard that the park police are doing the murder investigation, I knew there was something way wrong here. Way wrong, radically wrong, way off. And keep in mind that I really didn't have a whole opinion before that. Fast forward here a little bit. I'm working for Denver Cold Storage during the Clinton administration. Denver Cold Storage has a business with a company called Brandywine. Brandywine Chicken Products. Brandywine was a food corporation, and they dealt an awful lot with chicken. Denver Cold Storage, where I worked, would blast freeze fresh chicken by the truckload. There'd be 4 and 5, as I recall, trucks from the Brandywine company with fresh chicken, but fresh chicken has to be frozen quickly. That's why it's called blast freezing. And Denver Cold Storage would blast freeze it for them. So there are constantly trucks coming in with the fresh chicken, and then trucks leaving with the frozen chicken, if that makes sense, from the day before. Good business. Everything's copacetic. We did know at the time that Tyson Foods was based in Arkansas and was a big backer of Bill Clinton. That was known at the time. One day we come in, and we were always used to seeing those Brandywine trucks all the time. That's what you saw all the time. And there were none there that day. Well, let me back up a little bit. Let me back up just a tiny little bit. Again, this is personal stuff here. We had heard rumors that Tyson Foods was trying to buy Brandywine, both in the chicken business, and that Brandywine didn't want to sell. Rumors, schmoomers, whatever. Didn't think much about it. One day we come in, there's no Brandywine trucks there at all. What happened? Oh, well, there was an inspector, you see. An inspector discovered on Brandywine's property a contaminated well, and that all of Brandywine's operations were shut down. A contaminated well, who knew? And they were shut down. A couple weeks later, it was about 2 weeks as I recall, we learned that Brandywine sold their operations to Tyson. Shock. How'd that happen? Well, so they sold it. It was about a month after, as I recall, the entire Brandywine operation burnt to the ground, flat to the ground. On a Sunday morning at 3 o'clock is when that fire reportedly began. And you'll never guess what the cause was. An overloaded electrical circuit. You know, that's when we're really using up the electricity, right? 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Burnt flat to the ground. So in a very, very short time, you had one company, Tyson Foods, totally eliminate a strong competitor. You cannot tell me, you can try to tell me, you cannot tell me there's not deep corruption going on here. Deep corruption. And where does that corruption start in this case? Well, we've got a contaminated well. And you know the government is really concerned about contaminated wells. These same people that will have you contaminate yourself with a vicious jab of poison back in the day was concerned about contaminated wells. What's this have to do with our sermon here this morning? Do you remember what we just said about the king? Can't multiply horses, can't multiply wives, can't multiply gold and silver. This king is not allowed to enrich himself, because when he enriches himself, the king, it is always at the expense of the people that he's supposed to protect. Did you hear me on that? When civil authorities enrich themselves, it is always at the expense of the people that they're supposed to protect. In other words, they're supposed to protect people from theft, and they themselves have become the thieves. Understand this, my friends. This is the way it works. How do I know this? I know this because I read the Bible. Turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 12. We're going to start here. We're going to hang around in 1 Samuel 8 and 1 Samuel 22 today, starting 1 Samuel 12. I want you to see this, what Samuel said. They don't want to judge anymore. Samuel was the last judge. They're done with him. No more Samuel, and now things are going to be wonderful. 1 Samuel chapter 12. Now Samuel said, this is verse 1. Now Samuel said to all Israel, indeed, I have indeed heeded your voice and all that you have said to me, and have made a king over you. And now here is the king walking before you, and I am old and gray-headed, and look, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my childhood to this day. Okay, here's what I want you to see. Here I am, witness against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I received any bribe with which to blind my eyes? I will restore it to you. And they said, you have not cheated us or oppressed us, nor have you taken anything from any man's hand. Stop there for a minute. Name the politician, the governor, the president, the senator, whoever. Name anyone in authority who can say that. I don't think you're going to come up with a very long list of names. And Samuel standing before him and says, witness against me right now. Have I enriched myself at your expense at all ever? And the answer is no. That's about to change. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 8. Samuel's sons are dishonest. They turned aside after dishonest gain, verse 3 of chapter 8. All the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, look, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Remember that phrase from Deuteronomy earlier? Let's be like the other nations. That should solve things. Instead of dealing with his sons, let's go to a king. Let's make it worse. The thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me, that I should reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice, however you shall solemnly forewarn them, and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over you. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. Let's stop there for a minute. Keep in mind what we just read. In 1 Samuel 12, we just read, he asked, have I taken anything from you? One thing. And he names things. Whose ox? Whose sheep? You haven't done a single thing. You haven't stolen one thing from us, Samuel, not one. Well, like I say, that's about to change. So Samuel told, this is verse 10 of chapter 8, all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots to be his horsemen, and someone will be before his chariots. I'm going to read through this, my friends, and I want you to concentrate on two words while I read through this. And I so want to communicate this because the Bible speaks to the political sphere. And here we have it directly being said, what wicked rulers do. This is what they do. We have a description of it. We don't have to, again, guess. We don't have to search everywhere. We don't have to, it's right here. Concentrate on two words. Your and his. Because this king is about to get rich at their expense. So what's going to happen with his stuff and what's going to happen to your stuff? So here we go. This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his chariots, his own chariots, to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s, will set them to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, your olive groves, and give them to his servants. Don't forget that. We're going to see that in action in just a minute. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officers and servants. He will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants. My friends, I can't think of a more clear picture of what happens when the civil magistrate exceeds his God-given authority and responsibilities. And that, my friends, is the central idea of what I'm talking about here this morning. My central idea is that power enters when authority exits. Power is waiting at the door, my friends. When we reject the authority of God and his word, in all areas, especially that of civil authority, when we reject his authority, power guys are coming, and you will be their servants. And we are. And I don't know when tax liberation day is. It's funny, we talk about slavery. Well, if tax liberation day is until June or July or whatever, guess who you're working for half your life? Hint, it's not your family. It's not your progeny. You're working for the King Sauls of the world, right here. That's who you're working for. And guess what? They're getting stronger every day as we work for them. Well, that's not so bad. It's just a tenth. That's how we look at it, isn't it? Yeah, well, it's a tenth more than he should have had, King Saul. And it's enough of a bureaucracy. Can you see the bureaucracy building here? His captains, his officers, can you see it? A bunch of people that have no responsibility to anybody, but they have power. Power without responsibility. That is the definition of a bureaucracy, my friends, is it not? Power without responsibility. Those people that walk into Amos Miller's farm and take his stuff, they have no responsibility. Throw his stuff out, whatever. They have power. No responsibility whatsoever. Who do they answer to? Someone else who answers to no one. But I want you to see how this works. Because we could easily sit back and say, oh, well, you know what? It's only a tenth. We still have 9/10. It's okay. It's all right. And of course, we today would say, if all they took was a tenth, we'd be thrilled. But let's look and see what King Saul's going to do with all these goods. Now, before we do that, do you remember how we first introduced the King Saul? you remember? Samuel goes to anoint him. Can't find him because Saul is out looking for a donkey that was lost. Now, most of the time we read people in the Bible, especially Old Testament, they had like servants to do those kinds of things. Saul's family was so poor that he had to be the one to go out and look for the donkey. So the guy doesn't come from wealth. But we're going to find out that he has an awful lot of wealth all of a sudden. Wonder how he got it. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 22. A few pages over. Saul, is chasing down David. David has killed Goliath. Saul is exceptionally jealous. He has gone from protecting the people to protecting himself and his power. Didn't take long. You see, God's authority has been rejected. Man's power is filling the vacuum, as it will every time, my friends. Please understand that. So David, he's fleeing. David therefore departed, verse 1 of chapter 22, and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, so he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. And as I understand this, these people are discontented and in debt. There's a reason why they were in debt. They couldn't pay their taxes anymore, and they were losing their property. But somebody else is going to get their property. Don't forget that, right? When someone is taxed right out of their home due to these wicked property taxes, somebody's going to benefit from that. There's going to be profitability somewhere. Let's see how it works. Verse 6. When Saul heard that David and his men were with him, had been discovered. Now Saul was staying at Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah with his spear in his hand, and all his servants standing about him. There's Saul. He's got his spear. He was head and shoulders above anyone else in Israel. He's a very big man, and he's got his spear with him. And all his servants are standing around, wanting to do his bidding. He's got some power already. It didn't take long. What do you do with all this power? You see, again, when you're a civil magistrate and you have power, you got to use it at some point, right? That's how you maintain it. You keep people in fear. That's what you do. Sometime when you get a chance, compare Saul with Job. Job protected people from wicked people. In this case, Saul, supposed to be the protector, he becomes the wicked man. He becomes the thief. He becomes the plunderer. Let's see what he does with it. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you Benjamites. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with meaning Jonathan, has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is not one of you who is sorry for me, or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as it is this day." He's got the power. Who's he going to serve with the power? He's going to serve Saul. Saul's going to serve Saul. But look how he gets the power. Look how he gets it. Did you see it? Did you see it? I hope you do. Let's see. "Hear now, you Benjamites," verse 7, "will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands, captains of hundreds?" Saul now has fields and vineyards. Now, what would King Saul do with fields and vineyards? I have an idea. He's going to hand them out to his buddies to get them to do his bidding. He's going to use those material goods to get them to oppress their neighbors. And he's already been doing these kinds of things. And that's his way. He's saying, like, hey, you know what, guy? I'm going to give you stuff. Okay, I might have stolen the stuff from other innocent people, but I'm going to give you stuff. Do what I tell you. What a great comment on David, though. Apparently, Saul's saying, David's not going to do that for you. David's not going to maintain the bureaucracy by giving you stuff, other people's stuff, every time. You know, it was said, Oliver Cromwell came from a middle-class family, if you will. And it was said that when he was found out that in France, that they were persecuting the Huguenots that were left there, that Oliver Cromwell publicly wept deeply. And you know what he did next? He committed money to the cause of rescuing his reformed brethren. You know whose money it was? It was his, from his own pocket. He didn't run some kind of a new tax scheme to be, compassionate towards other people. It's easy to be compassionate with other people's money. I think even I could do that. I'll take your money and be compassionate over here. Yeah, what a compassionate guy. This wicked King Saul, way beyond his responsibility here, way beyond his bounds. Collecting things from people and rewarding other people to do wicked things. What kind of wicked things? Well, that'd be murder. Let's keep going. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul. I'm just going to read this here. You'll be able to, with very little comment. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. Okay, I am maybe going to make a few more comments than what I said I would make, very briefly here. How did this happen already? This didn't take long either. We got an Edomite, bossing around the Israelites. How'd that happen? We read in Deuteronomy that wasn't supposed to happen. You're supposed to get a king from among your brethren. I think that implies that people that are with you, people that are ruling over you, are also from among your brethren. Here's Doeg the Edomite, somehow wound his way into power over Saul's servants. You know how Doeg gets that kind of power? Because he was willing to do things that the servants of Saul weren't willing to do, like murder people, as we'll see. And he inquired of the Lord for him. This is Doeg still talking here. Went to the priest, gave him provision. The priest gave him provisions, gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. He answered, Here I am, my lord. Then Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day? So Ahimelech the priest answered the king and said, And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant, or to any in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much. Poor priest trying to use a little logic, and it's not going to go very far. And the king said, You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. Let's stop there for just a minute again. So the priest tells the king the truth. I didn't know about this. As far as I know, David is a loyal servant of yours, and I did for him just what I would do for any loyal servant of yours, and I didn't know anything about all this other intrigue that was going on. Now, when you have power, you don't have to get into the little back and forth of logical arguments. You don't have to do that. You got power. Saul understands that. Does Saul get into a little argument with the priest, say, well, you should have known, or, everybody knows this is going on, or you got to know that if he was running away, he's running away from... Little argument here? No. When you got the power, no discussion necessary. How do I know this? Well, after Ahimelech makes his defense, and the king said, verse 16, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. That's his answer. We got a little discussion here, a little back and forth, a little history of what happened. No. Ahimelech, I'm going to kill you and all that's yours. That's his answer. That's a man with power. Power that was never given to him by the creator of the universe. A man tremendously misusing power. But again, this is what the people have asked for. They've thrown out the authority of God, and in comes the power of man. Every time. So, the king said to the guards who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand is also with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests, and killed on that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep, with the edge of the sword. Why would you do that? Why'd you kill the animals? This little incident is going to get all over Israel. And everybody's going to be scared stiff to cross Saul. And his power has increased tremendously from just getting a tenth of their goods to having everybody in fear of him. You see, that's how tyranny works, isn't it? In any society, you're going to be in fear of something. Romans 13 says that the wicked should be in fear. They should be terrorized, if you will, by the sword. People should be terrorized. But in any society, understand this. Either the wicked are going to be terrorized by the righteous, or the righteous are going to be terrorized by the wicked. And that's what Saul is all about here. He is about spreading terror to everyone who's going to cross him. What's this have to do with the events of yesterday? There are so many layers. Do you remember that phrase from the Declaration of Independence, complaining about the King of England? He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Again, what's that have to do with anything? Well, here's my point. There are so many wicked people in so many powerful slots, and there's so much intrigue going on that it's hard to tell what in the world is going on. But know this: whenever anyone has power that God has not specifically ascribed to them, that they're going to misuse it eventually. Now, someone's going to ask this question, and it's a legitimate question. Well, does that mean that if God hasn't authorized a particular office, that I shouldn't be in that office? And I don't know if I can really answer that as well as I'd like. I'll just give an example. I think zoning laws are an attack on private property, for example. I believe that. Why should someone else be able to tell me what kind of... even things like... occupancy permits, right? Why do we need an occupancy permit? Because a bureaucrat knows better than I do what's safe for my own house, right? My goodness, if it wouldn't be for the bureaucrat, I'd probably build a really terrible house. The whole thing would crash and kill all my family. And what's really happening is we're saying that the bureaucrat has more concern about my family than I do. It's the same way with education, is it not? Because of government schools, what the government is saying is, if left to families, everybody would be illiterate. They wouldn't be able to tell a circle from a square, but thanks to us. And of course, after all these years of government schooling, half the graduates can't tell a circle from a square. You've heard the term functional illiterate. Think about it. Graduating, not being able to read. You had them for 12 years and they don't know how to read. My friends, don't really know exactly what went on yesterday. It sure looks like an assassination attempt. But what's happened to us is we have so many questions. And this goes back. You talk to older people who were around when Kennedy was assassinated, and no one believes. You talk to older people, no one believes it was just one lone gun guy who was Lee Harvey. They don't believe it. We've been taught that again and again. We were taught that there was the Warren Commission that looked into it, and our Senator Arlen Specter, who's now gone, was a big factor in that. And oh yeah, it's just one lone gunman. Yeah, one bullet entered Kennedy's head, came out. Almost 122 round. Are you familiar with 22 rounds? Target practice, not much more. Well, they can kill a person, but first 22 and last 22 bullet ever that went in one guy's head, came out the other side, then went in the other guy, and went in his, I guess, behind his ear and lodged somewhere in his chest or arm or whatever. One bullet. Nobody believes it. We've been lied to for such a long time. What you need to know is that people that are supposed to be out to protect you, once they become corrupt, are not out to protect you, they're out to destroy you. Understand that. And we see it all in the Bible, here in the life of Saul. My purpose this morning, few purposes, but one of them has been to let you know that the Bible does speak to the power of the civil magistrate, and does let us know specifically what happens when he exceeds his power and his authority. You know what happens? In the end, killing people. In the end. We shouldn't need more than 50 million, 60 million dead babies or whatever since Roe to demonstrate that for us. This was an opportunity I took to preach this sermon and to be able to point out to you what the Bible has to say about these kinds of things. As I've mentioned before, I don't like to veer too much off from where I am due to circumstances. But in this particular case, I felt it was a good opportunity. And I hope all of you will read and understand the Bible and recognize that there are specific limits set on the civil magistrate, and be able to recognize when those limits have been exceeded. It's my job as a pastor to communicate that to you. Now someone's going to ask, what do we do about it? Fortunately, where we are in Titus is going to address that next week. Titus is going to help us out with this next week. Shall we pray?